have set out to create a radical Islamic state where there would be complete Sharia law, and where they have said, in terms, have said quite clearly that any Christians living in their rule, under their rule, either have to convert, pay an extortionate tax called jizya, or else they'll be sentenced to death. And only this week we've seen photographs of men who have been crucified. There are groups, jihadist groups, who are radical Islamists, some of whom have set out to say that they were the opposition to the Assad regime, and therefore to try and court support from Western powers. And rather foolishly, I think sometimes we've been backing opposition groups, some of whom have agendas that seek to impose Sharia law and create Islamist states. Think about the events in the last week or so in Nigeria, where Boko Haram have been responsible for the abduction of several hundred Christian girls, and it said in reports this week that some of those have now been sold into slavery in Chad and the Cameroons. So my complaint is that not only are these wicked things happening, but we in the West have been indifferent to them.
You say that this has implications far beyond the Middle East. How is this going to affect the West?
I think that we in the West have been indifferent to radical Islamization, and because of that, we haven't seen that there are forces even within our own countries who have been aligned to some of these groups. I think, for instance, of the plight of the Coptic community in Egypt, and that some of those who were setting out to create constitutions in Egypt which would have made Christian Copts, who comprise around a fifth of the population, into second-class citizens because of the constitutional arrangements that they wanted to impose. And many of them have allies supporting those proposals in Western countries. So what we need to do is to get alongside those Muslims who believe in democracy, who believe in human rights, who believe in coexistence, and work to create precisely those kind of societies, both in the Middle East but in our own Western countries as well. Otherwise, we will wake up one day and find that not just specific incidents like the bombings on the London Underground or 9/11, but that these will become systematic in the way that they have done in the Middle East. So it's in all our interest to ensure that we take this threat seriously and wake up to the realities of what is happening to our co-religionists. People are persecuted all over the world for religious belief, but only Christians are persecuted in every single one of the countries identified as countries at risk of religious persecution.
What is what you have called their final solution? What do they want to do?
The reason why I talked about the final solution is because Adolf Hitler, talking about the genocide which was committed against the Armenians, he said, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" And this was when he was plotting to begin the final solution, the extermination of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, Polish people. Vast numbers of people were murdered, 6 million people who died in the Holocaust. At the end of the Second World War, the United Nations promulgated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18 of that declaration says that everyone has the right to hold whatever religious beliefs they wish to hold and to change them freely. Clearly that isn't worth the paper it's written on in many parts of the world today. We haven't championed religious liberty, the right to believe or not to believe, and we've treated this almost with indifference. And we can care about any number of other rights. One of the points I made in my remarks was that in our Westminster Parliament, we spent over 100 hours talking about the rights of foxes. Now, I'm not in favour of animal cruelty, but it seems disproportionate to me that we would spend so much time on every other species but our own. And perhaps one of these days, when a fox or an animal arrives at our Parliament or outside Congress holding a placard saying "Save the human race," we might see the illogicality and disproportionality of some of the positions that we embrace and uphold.
Are these radical Islamists trying to create an empire?
If you look at events in Egypt last year, I compared specifically the destruction of countless Coptic churches, the burning of buildings, the rape of young women, the murder of some Christians because of their religious beliefs. I compared those events with Kristallnacht and the events which led to the Holocaust in Germany. And that's why I think we have to see the parallel clearly, that people are being singled out because they refuse to conform. In so many countries where Sharia law has been promoted and where jihadist groups have been able to promote violence rather than coexistence, it is leading to an exodus of biblical proportions from countries like Iraq. And it's ironic that one of the countries that Christians in Iraq fled to was Syria, and think of their fate now. So yes, this is an attempt by some to extend an empire. We should be very careful about the groups we align ourselves with. One of my complaints has been that the so-called opposition groups in the Middle East, that Western countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom, have given significant support to, that some of those groups are even worse than the regimes that they're trying to replace. My real fear is that if the persistent campaign of violence continues, these ancient communities who have been there since the time of Christ himself, that they will be completely eradicated.
And then what will follow after that? If they are completely eradicated, what will happen?
Well, in the countries from which they are driven and where they are eradicated, we will see Muslims themselves suffering. And indeed, there are examples of that today. The Middle East will be a much poorer place if those minorities were to disappear. And if we allow that to happen, if we sleepwalk through this disaster, then it will not be long before we see the same phenomenon happening in our own countries too.